Well, good morning, Grace Chapel family. It's good to be with you. Thanks, Samantha, and thanks, Rocky, for sharing with us today. Thanks also to Mandy for joining me to do announcements this week. And we did hear back from Grandma Johnson, and she says that CJ was her favorite pastor the day he was born. So I guess I fell somewhere down the list after that, but it's good to be considered in the list, at least with CJ at some point. It's good to be with you this week, too, and I get to join in the summer series that we're doing on characters from the Old Testament and what we can learn from their lives. Last week I was so blessed, along with so many others, to hear about the life of Joseph and the great lesson in forgiveness that he is to us. Such a vivid story, such a powerful reminder of what we have been forgiven and how that allows us to forgive others as well. And so I get to follow in the footsteps of that series. And today we move on to Moses' life. And as I was thinking about it this week and hearing from how people were touched by forgiveness from Joseph, I thought about how Moses' life really is an example to us of persistence or perseverance. And so this week's sermon title is Moses, Model of Persistence. And I want to show you through his life and through his walk with God what he learned about persistence, how he put that into practice, and then how we also can learn those same things. And in this very difficult time, learn to be persistent through the challenges that we face in our everyday lives. And so if you would turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3, verse 10, we'll be there in just a moment, but I wanted to be prepared with that. Go to Exodus chapter 3, verse 10, and let me show you or set the stage a bit for where we are when we head into Exodus. Okay, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all written by Moses. But Genesis, all of the action and activity that takes place there happens well before Moses is even born. The last events of the book of Genesis happened more than 400 years before Moses' birth. And actually, the last thing that is mentioned is Joseph's life. And it's interesting to think about the book of Genesis from its very beginning, where it talks about the creation of the world, how God has set that up and made it a very good thing for us to dwell in. And we live then in the Garden of Eden together with him, where he walks with us in the cool of the day, and his presence is felt every moment of every day. That is until we get to Genesis chapter 3. And that great divide opens up between us and God, that great chasm that is sin, that causes separation and death. And life is no longer what it had been in the garden. And so the story of Genesis really is moving from that perfect situation into the situation we find ourselves in for the rest of human history here on earth until God comes again for us. And so the book of Genesis ends, and you can actually just turn back to it a couple of pages if you are in Exodus chapter 3. If you keep your thumb there and move back a couple of pages. It ends with the death of Joseph. And here's the last verse of the book of Genesis. It says this: "So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." And as you read that, think about the Israelites as they're reading that and experiencing that, as they're now living in Egypt after the death of Joseph for 400 years. Now, 400 years is a long time. What were you doing 400 years ago, right? Where was our country 400 years ago? Nothing was going on in terms of the United States of America 400 years ago. Okay, so that's a long time for people to live and die and to walk with God and to experience his presence or maybe even lack of presence in that time. And as they think about it, Joseph is now dead. He is now in a coffin in Egypt. And they have to be wondering what happened to all those promises that were made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. Way back in Genesis chapter 12, God had promised that he was going to make Abraham, he's going to do three things for him. He was going to give him a land, that is a place to dwell in, that would be filled with milk and honey. Not Egypt. It was going to be a different land, the land of Canaan that they were eventually going to go to. And that was a promise that was made. The second promise was that they would have a nation, that they would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And the third thing was that they were going to be a blessing, that God was going to bless them, and they were going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. But as you reach the end of Genesis, you have to be asking yourself the question, what happened? Where are all the promises of God? How are we now living more than 400 years and not having experienced any of those things? Where is the land? Where is the nation? And where is the blessing? That is what the context that Moses is born into. And the next time that God speaks, it's actually through that burning bush. And you can probably picture that or imagine that in your minds, that scene, what that must have looked like. The bush comes alive with fire and God speaks out of it. And this is probably the first time that people have heard the audible voice of God for hundreds of years. And it comes to Moses, and it gives him a very simple set of instructions. And this is where we are in Exodus chapter 3, verse 10. And I want you to see the simple instructions that are given to Moses here. It says, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Said very simply, right? Moses is just supposed to take these people of Israel and lead them out of Egypt. Of course, it's a simple thing to say, but it's not at all an easy thing to say. And I think actually that's the grace of God to Moses. And I want us to reflect on that in our own lives as well. What if God told Moses on the very first day all of the obstacles that he would have to overcome in order to lead these people from Egypt into Israel? Do you think Moses would have been enthusiastic about taking on that kind of job, knowing what was ahead of him? Now, we as an audience do get to know what's ahead, right? We know about all the things that are going to happen over the decades in the future of Moses' life. And I grew up in the 80s, and there was kind of a fantasy world there at that time where people were thinking about movies that talked about going into the future, traveling into the future to see what that would look like. One of those, of course, was Back to the Future, and it talked about the car that moved into the future, and they got to experience what life would have been like in the past and in the future as well. But one of the ones that I really liked was one that was called, what was it called? I just lost the title of it. It was called The Final Countdown. There it comes. And The Final Countdown, maybe you saw it, maybe you didn't, but it was about an aircraft carrier, a modern aircraft carrier, that gets zapped by a storm back to the day before Pearl Harbor happens in the 1940s. And the premise of the movie was, what would happen if a modern aircraft carrier was there before Pearl Harbor? What impact would it have on world history from that point forward? If you are into that kind of thing, maybe watch the movie, check it out. But that was kind of a fantasy, right? What would it be like if we could see what the future would be like, and how would it impact our lives? But Moses, I think, is given the great advantage that God does not tell him what his future is going to be like, because it would be confusing, overwhelming, intimidating to know all of the things that he was going to have to face in that future to get the people from where they are at in Egypt into the Promised Land. And so God gives him only what he needs to know for the next day or two. At the end of Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, sufficient for the day is the trouble thereof. And that is exactly right. We have enough problems to face in everyday life. We don't need to look down the future to a week from now, a month from now, 10 years from now, and face the difficulties that we will encounter then, today. We need to face them when they come. Man, I've heard so many people over the last weeks saying, well, what will it look like 2 months from now, a year from now? You guys, the fact of the matter is we don't know. Nobody knows. And so what we need to do is live in the presence with the grace that God gives us to do that right now. He gives us enough grace for today because we have enough trouble in this own day for itself. And so Moses gets that great grace of God that he only has to hear his instructions. And God is very specific about those instructions. He's supposed to bring the people out of Egypt. But there's going to be numerous obstacles in Moses' way. And that's why I want to talk with you today about persistence. How do we face obstacles that get in our way? And then how do we learn persistence through those obstacles and then move on to what it is that God has called us to be in our lives? So persistence, I think, is a key attribute to the Christian life, and it's taught to us through Moses' life. So I want to talk about 4 obstacles that are in Moses' way as he moves from Egypt into the Promised Land. And that the first of those obstacles actually is an interesting one. It is Moses himself. You see, the first obstacle we often face in all of our lives is ourselves. Our biggest challenge is ourselves, our own self-centeredness, our own laziness, our own misdirected passions, our own insecurities. Those are the things that cause us the most difficulty in our lives, and they are with us every day and everywhere. There's nowhere that we can go to escape from ourselves. And this is what Exodus 3:11 says. Just after God tells Moses what he wants him to do, Moses replies with, "Who am I?" Right? Moses is feeling his own inadequacy. And this brings into his life a bit of insecurity. Who am I? And we'll know about Moses in the coming chapters that he has a hard time speaking. Maybe he has a speech impediment, whatever it is. And he has many other things that might be excuses or might be obstacles within himself that would keep him from doing what God would ask him to do. You guys, in church history, this has been the trend at certain times. There have been people who have tried to escape from the world in order to deal with themselves apart from the sinfulness of the world. And so maybe they'll go and they'll live in a cave for a while. There have been parts of church history where people lived up on high pillars so that they would be absolutely alone, that there would be nobody else in their lives. And their idea, at least in part, was that they would escape from sinfulness by doing that. If they went and lived in a cave, there would be no temptations that would cause them to sin. The problem with that, though, is wherever you go, there you are, right? And there's plenty of sin that comes from within us that causes us to have all kinds of consternation and battle with sin. The book of James says this in chapter 1, verse 15. It says, "Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." Where does that desire come from? Does it have to come from somebody else? Or can it come just from within our own selves? And that's what the issue that Moses first deals with. The first obstacle that he has to encounter is his own inadequacy. And he looks around and he says, "I can't do it, Lord. You've called me to do something that I cannot do, that I have no ability to do." So what does God do to teach Moses to be persistent in spite of himself? And this is what I think God often uses in our lives as well. If we have something in ourselves that needs to be worked on, he'll bring something else along that will help us to work on it. And so the second thing that Moses encounters is a second obstacle, and that is Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the second obstacle in Moses' way between Egypt and the Promised Land. Now, Pharaoh would seem to be an obstacle primarily because he is the head of an incredibly powerful world empire. Right? How am I going to move the empire in order to be able to get the people out of Egypt? That's what had to have gone through Moses' mind at some point. But what Scripture tells us is that it's not the empire that is in Moses' way. It's not the empire of Egypt that is causing the difficulty. It is the heart of Pharaoh himself. You see, God has hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh himself has hardened his heart, so that he will refuse to do what God has called Moses to do with these people. And now we know about what happens in the next couple of chapters. There are 10 plagues that come along, right? One after another after another. And through this process, Moses is going to learn persistence. Think about the first plague, right? When he first walks into Pharaoh's throne room, and he says, "This is what God is going to do." How do you think Moses felt going in the first time? I mean, it could have been some level of excitement, right? Well, let's give this a shot and see what happens. But there was probably some anxiety, some fear, some trepidation. How is this going to go? What's it going to look like? Am I going to die from this challenge that I've brought to Pharaoh? But think about it then later, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th time. By this time, it's just got to have been getting old, right? There has to be a sense of losing some optimism that this is ever going to work. And so it takes persistence on Moses' part to keep going back to Pharaoh to challenge him to do what God has called Pharaoh to do, change his heart and let the people go. And this is preparing Moses for the next set of obstacles that he's going to have. You see, the next obstacle that is in Moses' way is actually the people. The people of Israel themselves. They are going to be the ones who are going to be the obstacle for the next 40 years of Moses' life. And so the people are going to be that major challenge to him. And as we read it, they do a bunch of complaining. There's a bunch of ingratitude towards Moses and towards God. There's the sinfulness of others that is causing everybody misery. It's exhausting to read, let alone to experience in real time. And Moses doesn't even know that this is going to be for 40 years. When they first come to the Promised Land, they have that encounter at Kadesh Barnea. It looks like it might just be weeks for them to travel. But it turns out it's going to be 40 years worth of this living in the wilderness. Now, I went to seminary in Portland, Oregon, and we moved up there about 24 years ago, just after Mandy and I got married. We'd been married for just a couple of months, and we moved up there with no jobs, no place to live. And so the very first thing that we needed to do was to find a place to live, find an apartment. And then Mandy and I started to look for our jobs to do. And she immediately found a job in a grocery store, and she worked there for several years. But I saw a sign advertising the possibility of driving a school bus. And for some reason that was intriguing to me. I don't know why. And I thought it might work well with my schedule. I could drive in the morning and the late afternoon, but maybe take some classes before and after that, or in the meantime there. And so I applied for the job as a school bus driver, and I was trained for the next couple of months. And I have to tell you that I greatly enjoyed driving a school bus. There's just something about being up that high, having that great view through all the windows and mirrors. And you get driving through Portland, it was beautiful, greenery, rivers, all those kinds of things. And I really enjoyed driving the school bus. That is, until I had kids on the bus. You see, the bus depot was 45 minutes away from my very first stop in the morning. And so I'd really enjoy being up there and experiencing the road from up in that driver's seat in that huge school bus. But as soon as the kids got on the bus, it was a whole different story. The elementary school kids were generally kind and respectful, but they had a very difficult time not being squirmy and moving around. So I'd have to constantly tell them, sit down, sit down, sit down. And that was more of my job than actually driving the school bus. But then later I'd also have junior hires, and that made it even more difficult. The junior hires had no respect for the bus driver. They had no sense that I had any authority or power over them. And so I thought about it for a while. What if I could go to the school district and ask them if I could just drive the bus without having any kids on it? because I love driving the bus, but having the kids was a totally different issue. But of course, if there's no kids, there's no need for a bus. The whole point of driving the school bus is getting the kids from the place that they live to the place that they need to go. So there's no point in thinking about ministry without the people. Ministry is the people. And this is what Moses had to learn during his time in the wilderness with those people. Is even when he was wrestling with God, and even when God was growing impatient, it was still he had to advocate for the people and be the one who is on their side, even if all circumstances are against them. And so Moses learns persistence from his time with Pharaoh, and he applies that to his time with the people as well. He gets 40 years to put that into practice, and so it's a good thing that he had learned it over those months with Pharaoh. He now is going to develop patience, perseverance, persistence, and courage that he will need for the rest of his life as well. Just after the book of Exodus comes the book of Joshua, in history at least. And in Joshua there's a very humorous line that I really enjoy. And it talks about the time of the people under Moses, and it looks back at that. And it's the time of transition now where Joshua is going to be the next leader of the people. And there's a very humorous line that's in chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. Now, it's humorous to me, and I know that my sense of humor is maybe different than others. At least my kids tell me that. But this is what is written. God has introduced Joshua as the new leader, and the people respond with these words. They say, "All that you have commanded us, we will do. And wherever you send us, we will go." Has that been their track record in the past? No. Look at this then. "Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so will we obey you." And as I think about that, Joshua has to be walking away, scratching his head, thinking, just as you obeyed Moses, man, I hope you can do a better job of obeying me than you did of obeying Moses, because the track record you had under him was not at all one of obedience or joyful obedience. So I picture the look on his face thinking, oh, please, try to do better than you did for Moses. That brings us to the last one then. It's the circumstances. The circumstances are going to be an obstacle for Moses that he's going to need to learn persistence in order to get past. Again, 40 years in a desert with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, that's a very difficult circumstance for Moses to be in. Those are incredibly difficult circumstances. And then he hears the constant complaining, all we have to eat is manna, there is nothing to drink, oh, these serpents are biting us. It's a miserable set of circumstances over those years with Moses. And I wonder if we don't face some parallels in our own life. And so I want to give us some tips or pointers, some principles on how we can remain persistent in our walk with the Lord. And the first of those principles is to know your place. It's to know your place. When God first came to Moses, Moses' first question was, "Who am I?" But God's response in the next verse was, "But I will be with you." You see, this is going to be a partnership between God and Moses. I think we often get caught up in our lives with trying to do things on our own. We want to do and be as independent as we possibly can be. And then if we get ourselves in trouble, okay, then maybe we might ask God for some help or somebody else for some help. But as far as I can, I'm going to do what I can on my own. And God does not intend that for our lives. We take the weight of the world on our shoulders when it doesn't belong to us. We want to or feel like we have to do what is actually God's job. Now, Paul David Tripp said something that stuck with me, though I wasn't able to find exactly where he said it, and maybe he said it in multiple different places. But he said something to the effect of this: you are not the fourth member of the Trinity. There is no job opening in the Trinity. God is not taking applications to do his job. It is not as if he needs it to be the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and Moses, or Brad, or Joe, or Sue. We cannot do God's job, and we should not try to do that which is his responsibility. We need to understand the limits of our own ability and our own responsibility, and that will help us in our persistence. We don't want to be persistent in the wrong things. We want to be persistent in the things that God has actually called us to. So think about this from Moses' perspective. Can Moses alone overcome all of his own feelings of inadequacy? Is Moses in himself equipped to deal with all of his own personality flaws and difficulties? No, he needs God's help. And by the way, he needs Aaron's help, and he needs many other people's help as well. God has put us into community because we need each other to work on our own difficulties, to overcome the obstacles that we present to ourselves in our own walk with God. Think about it from the second challenge. Can Moses change the hardened heart of Pharaoh? No. Can you change the hardened hearts of those around you? As much as you would like to, you cannot. Of course, you can pray. You can be available with truth and grace when the Lord is working on a hardened heart, but you cannot change it on your own. You have to be with God and have Him as a resource for you in that walk. What about, can Moses provide the daily manna and water that the people need in the wilderness? Can he overcome their circumstances on his own? No. Right? Jesus teaches us to pray, give us today our daily bread. Right? Give us this day our daily bread. It's only the bread that we need for today, and it only comes from God. We cannot cause it to happen on our own. So when Moses tries to take the responsibility for himself, he actually ends up disqualifying himself from entering into the promised land. He says, okay, let us bring water from this rock. Well, it's not us. It's God who's bringing the water from the rock. You guys, sometimes we agonize over things that are not our job. They are God's job. And by the way, He's got it. We should let Him do what only He can do and concentrate on what He has actually given us to be responsible for. So know what you are supposed to be responsible for and then be persistent at doing that. Not the million other things that you could do, but the few things that God has called you to do. Okay, the second principle I'd want us to think about in terms of this is focus. Right? Focus. Philip Yancey, in his book, Reaching for the Invisible God, shares an illustration from his own life. He talks about having a dictionary that is exhaustive, but it's also compact, which means that the font is incredibly hard to read without a magnifying glass. And he says this, I have learned about magnifying glasses using my dictionary. When I train the glass on a word, the tiny print shows up crisp and clear in the center or focal point, while around the edges it grows progressively distorted. In an exact parallel, Jesus has become the focal point of my faith. And increasingly, I am learning to keep the magnifying glass of my faith focused on Jesus. In my spiritual journey, as well as in my writing career, I have long lingered in the margins, pondering unanswerable questions about the problem of pain, the conundrums of prayer, providence versus free will, and other such matters. When I do so, everything becomes fuzzy. Looking at Jesus, however, restores clarity. I think this is very much applicable to us today as well. I've had numerous conversations over the last couple of weeks with people who are stuck on something peripheral. Whether that's a political thing, a health thing, whatever it might be, a theological thing, they just get stuck on something that is not the main thing. And oftentimes they don't realize it until they have a conversation with somebody and they're able to point that out to them. And so sometimes what I've found myself doing is just listening to them for a few minutes, hearing what the thing that their mind is dwelling on, and that cycle that they are spinning over and over and over again on their mind. And then I'll just ask them the simple question, are you stuck? Do you need help getting out of that spin cycle that you're in there? And I've seen the light go on in people's eyes and say, yeah, you know what, I didn't realize. I actually am stuck right now. And thank you for pointing it out and helping me to become unstuck. All of you guys, please, as you're listening to me, I bet there is somebody in your sphere of influence right now who is just plain stuck. Maybe it's you, but maybe it's a friend of yours or a family member, whatever it is. I'd encourage you to listen to them for a while. Be there to listen to what they're stuck on. And then help them to gain some perspective on their circumstance. Help them to see that maybe what they're stuck on isn't one of the main things. And if they turn their attention back to what was the main thing, Jesus Himself, then they may become unstuck in their problem. Be able to get past that particular obstacle in their lives. So I think it's really important to have those kinds of conversations with people in our lives right now. It does take a brother or sister oftentimes to get somebody unstuck from their problems. Okay? One further thing that I want to talk with you then about is just a particular instance in my life, a person in my life who actually modeled persistence for me. I want to tell you about a missionary couple. When I was in Kiev, Ukraine for the first time, I went to language school there. And the missions agency that I was under at the time sent a mentor couple, to the field with us. And that mentor couple was there just to provide kind of some spiritual insight to us, some encouragement as we were studying a difficult language. And so they chose this missionary couple who had just retired from the field in Japan. Now this couple had been there for over 40 years. And actually, Raleigh Reasoner and Esther Reasoner were their names, Raleigh and Esther Reasoner. And Raleigh had been one of the GIs who had first gone into Japan at the end of World War II. And he decided as he was going in as a soldier that he wanted to come back as a missionary, that he wanted to bring the most important news, the gospel, to the people of Japan. And so he came home, he got married, he started to raise support, and then he went back to Japan and started to learn the language. And it took him many years to learn the language and the culture, he and his wife, and they had many opportunities to interact with the Japanese. And Americans were not at all popular with Japanese in those days. And there was much that he had to do to kind of make himself ingratiated to the Japanese people. And it was a struggle. It was a long, hard work. And about 40 years into their ministry, Raleigh and Esther came home for a home assignment. And they went around to their supporting churches and to some of the individuals who were supporting them financially. And a lot of those people were saying, you know, Raleigh and Esther, it's been enough. You've been working hard in Japan for all these years, but you've only seen 3 or 4 people come to know the Lord at that time. And so Raleigh and Esther were thinking about that a lot, and they thought, yes, it's really true. Our ministry has only produced what looks like a little bit of fruit. But they also felt strongly that God was calling them back to one more term of service in Japan. And so for 4 more years, they went back to Japan. And they renewed some of those relationships that they had in the past, but also started to develop some new relationships. And in the last 4 years, they saw many more people than they had in the first 40 years come to know the Lord. And 2 to 3 churches were planted because of their ministry. And certainly seeds had been planted in the first 40 years. But over those last 4 years, dozens of people came to know the Lord, and churches were started out of it. And so I think about Raleigh and Esther Reasoner as perfect examples of persistence. They decided to stick it out because they knew what God was calling them to do, and they saw the fruit that comes out of that. Now, not always do we see the fruits of all of our labors. And I thank God that He allowed Raleigh and Esther to see some of that and to experience that kind of joy, because they truly loved the people that they were ministering to. But not always does that happen. Somebody can be faithful in ministry for many years without any physical fruits from that, or at least observable fruits from that. But you guys, that's not what God calls us to. He doesn't call us to know the results of our labors necessarily. He calls us to be faithful and persistent in what He has called us to do. And so that's what we are responsible for. Everything else is in His hands. He is building His kingdom. He is building His church. We just need to be persistent in doing the things that He has called us individually to do. And so that's my encouragement to you this week. Just be persistent in what it is that God